Okay, so for this afternoon, we're going to be reporting back on what has been done since yesterday. So, as was marked in the program, we're going to begin the afternoon by reporting back on the visits the 4 visits we made yesterday afternoon. Then, the content of the workshops from this morning, the 4 workshops from this morning. After that, we will hand over to our guest cities with the World Heritage Cities, and then we will have a concluding session with Didier Jeanjean, Céline Papin, who are both here, and Gaël Detis, who has just arrived as well. At the end of the afternoon, so for the reports on the strolls, the visits yesterday afternoon, if Paul Trouillot could come up onto the stage, Fleur Scherer, Manuel Bonneau, François Durquety, and have I forgotten anybody? And Marie-Alix Bouy. And I'm sorry, but we're short of a chair again. Somebody will have to stay standing up. Can we find? There's a chair on its way. The chair is coming. Thank you very much. Paul, would you like to begin? So speak into the microphone because this is being recorded and translated into English, and that will make it easier for the translation and the recording. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Sylvain. As an introduction, I'd like to keep this short, but I'd just like to take a moment to thank the organisers. I've really enjoyed the last couple of days, and congratulations to the organisers. I know it's a lot of work, but it's very successful. It's worth it. So the theme is very interesting. History and landscape, just the sort of thing I like to talk about. And I'm going to tell you about our urban stroll yesterday afternoon, which was group number 1, Bordeaux Port of the Moon, from the quayside to Place Gambetta and the major development operations inherited from the 18th through the 21st centuries. So a very well chosen route with 7 stages, with visits, historic visits, and following a chronological order. That might have been totally a coincidence, but it worked out very well. And also following the sequence of the renovation programs and the landscape work on these historic parts of the city, starting on the 18th century quayside and through to the renovation of Place Gambetta, delivered just a few months ago. And we were lucky enough also to go visit Rue de Tutelle, which is one of the last, Rue des Piliers de Tutelle, one of the last operations, most recent operations being handled by the city, with an example of greening of a street in a historic district. And then also we stopped on the Allée de Tourny, where the operation is yet to come. And the consultation process has just been started, a very rich, comprehensive program with examples from history and some very practical examples of some successful renaturing, greening operations in historic parts of the city, in the UNESCO listed part of the city. So we can keep it very short for those who aren't familiar with Bordeaux, who weren't present for this walk. First of all, the quaysides, one of the iconic sites of Bordeaux, It was one of the sites that was at the beginning of the renovation process to wake up the city of Bordeaux along a 4 kilometre stretch of quaysides, transforming a place that had never been a garden, where there had never ever been any vegetation since the 18th century, the port of Bordeaux, and even before that, back to the Middle Ages. So always port activities accessible and open to the river, but closed off from the city by the port facilities, the buildings, the hangar buildings along the quayside, which in the international architecture competition won by Mr. Courageux and his team were part of the full transformation of the quayside. So a perfect example showing how it's possible to magnify the historic river frontage of the city with development which contributed, I'm sure, to the UNESCO listing of Bordeaux, which wasn't listed before that, which has revealed the architectural quality, magnified the history and the architecture of the city, while proposing a landscape and very sophisticated gardens. And a garden which was totally invented from scratch and adapted to the site. So a great example of a huge success. And if you haven't been there, go see it. And also it was an opportunity to look at the questions of mobility, nature, lighting, to make the area more attractive, with the water mirror also. So a very important project for a landscape architect. So after some rain, which is normal in Bordeaux, we went to Place des Quinconces, the former Chateau Trompette, the fortress that used to be there, which I mentioned yesterday morning. And I explained the fact that it is urgent to prepare to do something with the trees on Place des Quinconces. 900 plane trees. I learnt a lot about this, planted not all at the same time, in 1848, then a lot of planting in 1920, and then so there are plane trees of over 150 years old, which were imported directly with two hybrid crossbred species. I won't go into all the details of all the botanical details. And the key is always to find the right tree for the right place, and that's why the plane tree was chosen. Over here, there's the soil quality. It's a very damp place, the Place des Quinconces. There's a lot of water. The soil is marshy, a very poor quality. And if you look at an aerial photograph of Bordeaux, and if you compare the size, you'll see that the size of the plane trees isn't the same everywhere. And that actually reveals where you have the remains of the walls, the foundations of the former fortress. In those places, the trees are a little less tall. Trees that have always been criticized. At the time, people didn't want to have nature in the city. But these trees have often been criticized over the years. People have wanted them to be pruned because they were projecting too much shade onto the frontages of the historic buildings. And all of that, having said all of that, those trees are already in danger of dying. There is plane tree disease, which is on the doorstep of Bordeaux, for which we don't have any possible treatment. And we hope this will not happen straight away, but it's already in Arcachon, which isn't very far away, so these trees are condemned to die very probably. So with these 900 plane trees, that's a huge number of plane trees. Most of them are over 100 years old, and that raises a lot of questions. And for the moment, we do not know what species of tree we can use to replace it to keep the quality of the place. And so there is the distance between the trees, which is part of the composition of the whole site, but and also with the light, the opacity, the shade, the light. How can we create that again in the future with different species? How can we shift from a system with one species to multiple species while taking account of the history of the place? That's a very big challenge. The third halt on our way was as we moved into the 19th century with the Jardin Public, the public garden, from the Romantic period with the animals, the rowing boats, the ponds, the lakes. Here we have trees which were all planted at the same time, all about 150 years old for the oldest. The director of the garden reassured us that the conifers are well suited to the park, are in good health, but there are several species, notably chestnut trees, which are probably condemned to disappear. And there are a lot of trees, young trees being planted to replace the older ones and to prepare for the death of the older trees. A tree that's 150 years old often is going to die soon. Some trees will also have to be felled, but they've prepared for this by planting young trees, and that's a wonderful way to go about it. And for this perfectly classical 19th century garden. And then there's also the mosaic layout of plants. Even though it's expensive, it's a lot of work, but that should be continued. After the Jardin Public, we went to the Rond-Point Tourny, a roundabout, a square, which was a historic square of Bordeaux. And we have the star-shaped layout and imitating the layouts of tracks which you see often in forests, with a choice to have a systematic layout of the road. So here we have this with the buildings, which are very interesting. And then the choice has been made here to renovate the buildings and the square. And this raises the question of whether there is a place for nature. Here, the choice here that was made is that there are no trees or any vegetation on this square. There were a lot of discussions about that for this square. So the way it has been developed is now done. We have to see whether it's not possible to introduce a little bit greenery perhaps in containers, but it's not ideal. So if we just replant the trees that are missing at the start, next to there's a few trees which were removed, and there if we could just plant a few more trees, we could really make it coherent and consistent with the area around it. Then we went up the Allée de Tourny with 200 lime trees, which there's a lot of work here done with an underground car park in the last century, and there's not sufficient thickness of substrate and soil. So there are 200 lime trees which are struggling. They are there, but they're not doing very well. They're not flourishing, and we have to see how we address the future of this. So the large-scale consultation process about this square is being launched with the shopkeepers and people who live there this month. Let's hope that the people of Bordeaux will take part in this consultation, because it really concerns everybody. It's the very heart of the city. It's one of the iconic sites of Bordeaux, the Allée de Tourny. The professionals like us discussed the site yesterday. For us, it's obvious that we have the historic plans with the lines of trees that we can see in the historic layout. Nothing has changed on the buildings. Let's try to return to the classical style it had previously. There was a vision which took account of the light, The trees were closer to the front of the buildings on the west to provide shade, further away from the buildings on the east to allow the light through. Let's just get back to basics, to the fundamentals here, but time is moving on. There's a lot of local people taking part in the consultation, and there's also the question here of the car, which has come to take too much space on this square, so we need to give space back to cycles and to pedestrians here in the city centre. It's not going to be impossible, but it's going to take some doing in the future. And we'll be following that particular case very closely. And then 2 more stops on our visit. After the Allée de Tourny, we went to Place Gambetta, recently redesigned, with a program defined by the municipality, the Metropolitan Authority, with quite a big budget for a very popular place that attracts a lot of visitors. So here, a square that attracts a lot of people, and I think the program does correspond to that. They wanted the square to be very open, very smoothly flowing, to allow all the possible uses of the square, to allow people to sit down, to settle here, with benches in the shade of the remaining chestnut trees and the magnolias which have been saved. So it's a very fine example of a renovation. It keeps the romantic style of the 19th century. It hasn't lost the character, the historic character of the square. We don't agree on the origins of the plan. There were many different versions before the drawings were completed by a landscape architect. And we talked a lot about this yesterday, about the place of water in the city, because to have a cool atmosphere, it's not just a question of shade, there's water as well to provide coolness in the city. So there's the fountain, obviously, which is an issue for the municipalities, but we have to have these fountains and water features, these spaces to cool down in very severe hot waves in summer. And this has been well designed on this square. There's no longer the former ponds, and now there's a fountain. And we can also notice that it was previously a roundabout for vehicles. Now, there are certain sides of the square where there's no vehicle access, to open it more to pedestrians and other people. And before we came back to the town hall, we did one more stop in Rue des Piliers de Tutelle, one of the latest redevelopment projects, with applying the charter of the city of Bordeaux, with stone buildings. And here the idea is to to create some flower beds or vegetation, despite all the different demands with the different utility networks underground, the need for space for cycles, for pedestrians, and we think this is possible. And there are trees, shrubs which have been planted, and nature is generous when we give it the possibility to grow and to flourish. And I'm sure that this will be successful because the range of plants which has been chosen is the right one. We just need to be patient now. Sometimes one species will prevail over another or dominate another. We can try lots of different things, but we're working with living things here. We have to be modest. And if it doesn't work out first time, we have to try again, keep on working, because I'm sure we can come up with some good results. That's certain. I won't go on any longer. Thank you very much, Paul.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you very much also to the people that joined us yesterday. Sabina Resté, who's a landscape designer, Xavier Marcuzaro, who works in the planning department, Eric Barrière, the historical gardener of the landscape artist of the quaysides, the director of the Jardin Public, Christophe Dangle, who is responsible for trees, Romarion, and Vincent Cassigno. And thank you, Paul, for joining us in your very dynamic manner on our tour. So if you have any questions, if you have any like to compliment anything that I've said, yes. Well, I'd just like to say for all of the visits, perhaps it would be a good idea to, in the restitution, to think of questions we're thinking of. And I think if everybody is aware that they talk about this visit from their perspective. So at this table, we'll have all of different styles of restitution that then we'll have this transversal approach. So now we'll hand over to Francois, and then we'll leave some time at the end to have an exchange. So Francois, over to you. Well, hello, everybody, for who I have not yet said hello to today. So I'm going to tell you about our walk yesterday afternoon from Place Pays-Berlon, where there is the cathedral, all the way out to the boulevards after the Chartreuse Cemetery. And so this was a very interesting, rich visit because we went through different spaces, diverse spaces, and through different historical periods as well. Something that I think that was quite present was the presence of water in the territory of Bordeaux, in the Bordeaux region. This is a swamp area originally, and everything is built over these. The city's been built over these wetlands. So the cathedral and the town hall, obviously a very central spot to the city, and we were given were explained to us the planting scheme for trees on the Place Pays-Berlon, the few trees that it was possible to plant, that was done by the Pôle Territorial in Bordeaux. And this was interesting because it was a collection of constraints and problems and challenges in order to be able to plant some trees. And they were particularly selecting species of trees that were transparent enough to leave views open through the leaves and the canopy to see the facades. So an interesting discussion there with the architect of France. Very strict constraints as well around the question of the emergency services and the fire department leaving open access of 15 meters wide all the way around the cathedral, and of course historical site, a very rich historical site, and archaeological site as well. There are a lot of different digs and archaeological digs that had to be done before anything else was done. So a lot of refreshing, this cooling down, this very minerable square in a very historic, very urban environment, became very, very complex. And this is something that really did surprise me. And this is very personal to me, but I found it interesting to finding a species of tree that is transparent. So the trees are very well, perfectly aligned, and they almost need to be invisible. So this is the kind of challenge. Of course, we can see them, and they are going to grow. What's interesting with trees is we can plant them small, and then over time, year after year, they become larger and larger. And their role. And we also had exchanges around the history of the square, the Pays-Berlon Square, in the Middle Ages. You can see the cathedral. It was absolutely surrounded by buildings that came right up to the edge of it. It was in the 19th century, unless I'm mistaken, that this space was created around the cathedral. So it's not actually that old, really. It's what one realizes that it's actually quite a modern space, the square itself. And then in the 20th century, it was the period of cars, so it was basically a very large roundabout, and it just had cars you could go around constantly. Then there was this project making it a pedestrian space and reducing cars. And so the latest intervention, and we'll hope this will be reinforced in terms of increasing the presence of a greenery on this square, but it is evolving. Then we went the other side. We went around the back of the town hall, in fact, because the town hall looks onto the square, and that's where you have the courtyard. And we went around the back of the town hall where there's the gardens of the town hall itself. which was a private mansion historically, and very classical design. But we did discover that there were some interesting things that are being developed in the garden. There's some new projects there and planting as well. And then we saw that there are two remarkable trees, an olive tree that was planted by Isaac Rabin and an oak tree recently planted by Charles III of England. So an interesting space, very emblematic space that remains classic nonetheless, very classical space. So then we move towards the Meriadeck neighborhood. So there we've got a 1960s neighborhood that was created from scratch with a raised level to get above the wetland zone, shall we say. So we went up to this raised level of this neighborhood. And there were interesting exchanges that took place here because we were told that there are projects being studied to modify the landscape of the raised gardens. And the participants in our tour who were not familiar with the site were able to say what they thought of it. And interestingly enough, people found it to be a very interesting space. It was a haven of peace and a space that should be protected. In the park area of the raised gardens there's a raised level, there's an aesthetic quality to it. And there are some questions about this requalification project of these gardens and what will be done. And I think what everybody did agree on, as soon as you get out of the garden area and you're in the raised zones around it, the more urban zones, shall we say, then there's huge potential here to be able to increase the quality of the environment there and to green this area. So it's the edge areas, shall we say, and the pathways around. And then we went down to the Cours du Maréchal Juin. Second project we then saw after the trees on Pays Berlin, we saw a project underway, and this is where there has been planting done down the center of the road. And this is an extremely wide road, and there's a great deal of space that's available, in fact, there. So it was possible to have bike lanes, bus lanes, to create some very green zones as well. And so it's interesting, in fact, this width was created during the 60s when they developed Meriadeck, and this was for basically to bring a highway directly into the center of town, and then little by little, this capacity was not being used, and then the tramway was added further towards the boulevard near the police headquarters, which reduced the width of the street here. So the traffic ultimately now is very low compared to the capacity of the road, and therefore we were able to recover some of this, to reclaim some of this space of this very wide road to be able to adapt the city to climate change. So then there was a fireman waiting for us. That was well organized. So then we were able to have a brief exchange with the fireman. Because obviously the question of firefighting is very pertinent, and it's a complex subject when you are trying to do public planning, and often there can be quite difficult discussions with the emergency services that have very strict rules in terms of widths for them to be able to park their vehicles and install the ladders, etc. So, for example, Cours Victor Hugo is not compatible with other fire services. So if we were to respect the rules, we'd have to cut down half the trees on Cours Victor, just to give you an idea of the level of requirements that the fire services have. So perhaps there's some possibilities here to reform these rules. We need to be smart about this. If we want to green more, we're going to have to think about these things. Bearing in mind that this actually cools down, and it's a question of public health as well, because heat waves are a cause of death, of course. So therefore, this is also a question of public health. We then went to a triangular zone that Mr. Jeanjean had described to us, which is next to the St. Bruno's school. And there's quite a large triangle here. And we're learning, therefore, that there's a project here to get rid of one side of traffic, and this would allow the creation of another garden area. We then wanted to go into the cemetery, but unfortunately, we were a little bit late. We weren't allowed in. We heard the bells toll, and we could see the immensity of this Chartres cemetery. So a very different, very unique space, but there are possibilities to open this up perhaps a little bit more and to valorize this space where there are a lot of trees and have it communicate more with the rest of the town. And then we got to the boulevards, where there is another project underway, a very substantial project. And the boulevards is the city of Bordeaux and the town of Bordeaux and the towns that they want to requalify these boulevards, in fact, and to come back to this idea of it being a planted promenade. But we had a very long list of the constraints and the challenges around these boulevards in terms of achieving this. So the major consultation underway with members of the public, and we were able to see some flowers. There were some projects there that we were able to see where there's some tables have been installed and some flowers as well, even if there's a lot of noise, a lot of traffic. So good luck to the person who is responsible for that project. It's going to be quite a challenge to make that a pleasant environment that people can share. And there is our outing report. So thank you very much, Francois. And just to say, the fact that the cemetery is closed goes to show that its opening hours are completely inadapted to it becoming a park. So now Marie-Alix, who is going to be talking to us about the visit to Bassin à Flot. Hello. So, yes, I did the tour on the Bassin à Flot. When we talk about heritage, the Bassin à Flot is very much part of the industrial and port heritage of the city. It was completely different to the other visits that have taken place, of course, because we're in an area that's been completely renovated and redone here since 2011, and there's been work on improving this, and we had quite a pragmatic beginning. It was raining, so we went and got some out of the rain, and we were given a magnificent view of the area, and we explained where this project came from, what were the objectives of this, the challenges in terms of urban planning, and all of the subjects around this, which really did give a clear theme to our visit and the subject of greening. So the Bassin à Flot in 2011, as we were saying, the town wanted to go fast with this project. We started with negotiated urban planning here. So in terms of all the constraints, in terms of co-building, co-designing public areas, and it is around this theme of negotiated urban planning, in which there are rules which are quite free, in fact, quite relaxed. And then there's workshops, and through these workshops, people co-build, co-design with all of the different stakeholders on the site in terms of the different operations, the different realizations in terms of urban planning. So there's a number of different actors involved in this area. Bordeaux Metropolis, of course, institutions, the Maritime Bridge, the City of Bordeaux, and as well as all the building partners on different levels, of course. And then we moved on to the constraints of the site itself. We had this because we were able to have this bird's eye view, we were able to see where the actual huge water areas are that take up a great deal of space, and then it's all concrete around it, and we're not entirely sure what's happening in all of these spaces. And this concrete area, it was not planned necessarily or initially to green this area, but it's these slabs of concrete, very dry, very mineral, and not really a plan that would allow us to green this area. This heritage is also a wealth, but it's also a very strong constraint, very restrictive, because when you green, we have to ensure that we keep this visibility in terms of the identifiable heritage, in terms of the submarine base, which dates from the Second World War, but there are others that are more specific to the industrial and port past. So it used to be a wasteland that was very much for the port activities, and then there were new roads, everything was completely redesigned, public spaces that did not exist previously. And one of the other restrictions and challenges is the fact that it is floodable. So that it is a very floodable area, and so this needed to be taken into account in terms of projects, building, planning, and also when we do landscaping as well, we need to bear in mind the reality of the possibility of flooding in terms of opacity, transparency, where do we dig, where do we raise ground levels, etc. And flooding, of course, has an impact on the basins as well, the actual water zones, and the car parks should have been on the ground level. They couldn't go underground, of course, because of the floodability of the area. So therefore, we had to find new elements to green these areas, and looking at these suspended gardens or hanging gardens as well. And then talking to you about the quite relaxed rules that there are as well, to be able to give meaning to this negotiated planning, to give a little bit more latitude and more importance as well to collaboration and negotiations in order to develop a new type of town together. And there's also the guidelines, because there's the Bassin Affluent d'Eau goes around this co-produced project with Michelin, which because the initial plan, the initial guidelines in 2011 has evolved a great deal since 2023. What we did was, quite recently, we've looked at how comparing the 2011 version with the 2023 version that was updated only last year, and how do they compare, and notably in terms of greening. And we saw that everything with regards to parks and gardens that are accessible to the public, because when we talk about these green areas, it's which ones are accessible to the general public, in addition to private islands, etc. So we went from 30,000 square meters in 2011 into more than 65,000 square meters in 2023 for parks and gardens that are accessible to the general public. And therefore, this guideline evolved over time and integrated new greening projects in that quarter, notably around this port zone. Then we we stopped off at several sites, notably in order to see the landscaping that had been done, the planting that is still underway, the works that are underway or will be starting soon. And we stopped at different sites, one that had been completed, a park area. There's also the idea of circulation to give access to the waterside, with a lot of new inhabitants moving in and a lot of new users moving into this neighborhood. So to create pathways for cyclists, for pedestrians that are peaceful, that are only for a non-motorized transport, and that does re-establish this access to the water, perpendicular access to the water. And then we're then planted, and this was quite innovative at the time because it was extremely complex doing this, notably in terms of land ownership, etc. And so we did have walk through these areas and these public spaces that have been greened. And one of the specific actions, in addition to the public planning, it was these raised or hanging gardens. So we did visit one of the examples of this that was done by Let's Grow landscape company, which is not accessible to the inhabitants, but it does have a role of cooling for this island and the inhabitants. So this is a raised garden that's above the car park on the ground floor, and it has 60 centimeters of soil. And the challenge here was to plant species that would colonize this space over time, and they would reseed themselves naturally to have a more spontaneous growth. And this was a question we were constantly discussing during our tour into where is nature's role in these spaces. Sometimes there's a lot of restrictions around it. Sometimes it can't obviously encroach on circulation areas and needs to be looked after and managed, contrary to the suspended spaces where it was totally spontaneous because it's not accessible and people don't go there. So it could be left to just do its own devices, as it were. But the challenge with this space is so all of the species are not possible because you have to make sure that the concrete does not get damaged underneath the garden itself. So therefore, there's a lot of poplar trees that started growing naturally, quite spontaneously. They were not planned, and this is totally incompatible with the structure itself. So they had to be cut. The poplar trees were cut last year in June, and this is the responsibility of the actual building owners. But it was interesting. Somebody came back to us and they ran after us and they caught us when we were leaving the building. And they said if we had anything to do with the poplar trees that were cut down during the heat wave, and that these poplar trees cooled down and gave us shade. And she went to 40 degrees temperature after these poplar trees had been cut down. So the cooling of towns, just goes to show how this is impacted by greening, because we were also asking ourselves this question of how do we cool down towns? What's the feedback we get from users, from inhabitants and people who travel in the area and visit? And this experience really was purely by chance. Of course, we weren't planning to meet that person. That garden was not designed to have high trees because it would damage the structure beneath, but it was very interesting to have that feedback from that local inhabitant. So now, in terms of public planning, we finished our tour with a major project that's very important to us here, and this is the park behind the base, which is 15 hectares, and we will be working on this very soon. We'll be breaking ground in March, and this is a space which is 100% accessible to all members of the public 24 hours a day. It will not be fenced, it will not be closed off, so people will be able to go even at night during heat waves with lots of different types of planting. And this is why it's such an interesting project, is that there are areas where people will be able to picnic and people can spend time, and there'll also be much more dense and confined growth where you will not be able to access these to really let spontaneous vegetation develop. And over these hectares, there'll be different types of design, different types of natural areas that will participate with vegetalized or greening and cooling the town. And then in terms of, once again, these species, the popular tree that could not grow on the building, but they do provide a great deal of shade because they have a canopy, and cooling obviously is a question of these things. How do we integrate the different parameters of these species with the evaporation, planting in soils, all of these different elements, all of these different components, as in addition to the efforts made by private operators, private property owners that are also participating in this action, and then inhabitants outside of the town as well in their own homes. And that is my feedback from our visit. So thank you very much indeed. And to conclude now, there's the third promenade, and this is Emmanuel and Flore.
With some background information first, which I'm Emmanuel Bonneau, Director of the Town Planning Department at Bordeaux Montaigne University. I'll hand over to Flore in a moment to give an overview. So we started on the Place des Quinconces and went over onto the right bank of the river, which was developed recently. A lot of operations were there which started at the beginning of the 2000s to take back the industrial wastelands, the brownfield sites. So we went for a tour around the first operations, including Place Stalingrad, the square, and RUTA near it, which leads down to the quayside, and Allée de Serre, which goes past the former Orléans railway station, which is now a cinema. So this was the first phase in the renovation of the Bastide district on the right bank of the river, which provided an insight into the policy of the city of Bordeaux when it came to greening, and also an insight into the limits which were faced on these very busy sites, notably Place Stalingrad being a multimodal transport hub. Then we headed off towards Bastille-Niel, a new district which is currently being developed, represents some 30 hectares, where with Rémi Salle we looked through the eyes of the landscape designer. We were shown the first phase by Clémence Salas, and so during these visits we saw the fit between the different roles of the project manager, client and managers of the sites. And with Rémi Salle we visited the public spaces which had been shown in the presentation in the morning, to see how plants have really found their place everywhere, even in the small cracks in the ground. Then that brought us back to the first part of the operation and the botanical garden, and it was Quentin Béjot and Isabelle Ducos who talked about the architecture and the garden, and then came back down to the riverside to delve into the question of management with Barrière, who works on the green spaces of the city of Bordeaux and who talked about the layout of the Parc aux Angéliques, the Angélique Park. And so what was interesting was that we were able to show reveal a certain number of issues with the range of different stakeholders who make their contributions to our cities and their landscapes. There were a number of questions about the objectives and the methods. Regarding the objective, the aim was to plant species in a larger space in public spaces. We saw Allée Serre, the Parc aux Angéliques, and to reveal older landscapes from certain viewpoints onto the city, towards the left bank of the city. And so the views across to the left bank. Then we looked into questions of method to see how we can ensure continuity, spatial continuity, and also terrestrial continuity with what has been done previously, and also in the way that things are done, and then at what is being done around the site, because as Emmanuel said, we have several people working on small areas of public space here, and we have to pay attention to make sure that those public things developed for public clients will fit together to form a coherent strategy. And there is a broader strategy for this area, a territorial strategy, and we have to see how that is shared by the different links in the chain. The other challenge which was identified also was to get feedback on the impact of the action that is conducted, with the managers raising the question of evaluation and whether what has been done corresponds to the objectives. And for those working on these projects or managing these projects that have now been built, there are a certain number of requirements and obligations which they face, which raises the question of how they choose, how they make their choices between the different possibilities. And this question often comes up of making choices in the face of urgent situations, which also raises the question, ultimately, of how we manage time or how we prepare for things in our decision making. So here in the Parc aux Angéliques, there were some magnificent trees on the dike which needed to be cut down, which were likely to create a breach, and so we were studying these different requirements. Management on the one hand, also greening, while at the same time there are security issues. For the Tour de France cycle race, we had to take out all the shrubs and plants so that there was nothing to make a nasty surprise for the cyclists. But how do we communicate? How do we understand how to do these things with the different services? despite these contradictory instructions, and also it's difficult for the population who don't understand what the situation is. So one of the focuses here was the development of public spaces in this new district. A number of experiments have been conducted, notably in the Niel district, and the aim was to see whether these can be a model to be followed by the historic city centre, obviously with the different requirements which apply there, and how this can be complementary with the historic part of the city, and in the uses of these spaces and of the green spaces on both sides of the river. What scale should apply to these planted public spaces, also in relation to cooling? Is it the street or a district of streets, or a larger scale that needs to be taken into account for greening to achieve our objectives? And the last thing which was addressed was to look under the surface of the soil. We've talked a lot about above the surface, but look under the surface for the network of plants. Because if you want those plants to thrive, there need to be networks of roots under the surface, and that raises the question of water as well. And if we want plants growing on the surface, under the surface, there needs to be root networks and water. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Explanations? Reactions? I'll hand over the microphone here. It'll be an opportunity to walk a little bit. I haven't walked enough today. If I understood correctly from one of the speakers, that we can green spaces when we want, but that there can be spaces which aren't accessible to residents. You said there is a space which we were able to do greening because there weren't the requirements that come from having residents, because that space is not accessible to the residents. Is that what was said? Yeah. This specific space is a raised garden which has been created, but it's right next to the windows of the apartments. So pretty much all the apartments look directly onto the raised garden, and at the time it was asked that the garden should not be accessible to avoid any noise or other disruptions. But because the garden is not accessible, that allows much more freedom in allowing spontaneous vegetation growth, whereas usually when we're planting in spaces where there are people moving through, that needs more maintenance. I hadn't finished. So, and then you said that the poplar trees grew wild spontaneously, and they were cut now to avoid affecting the water tightness of above the car park. My reasoning is that as we have this vegetation which has been installed, we could close the car park or stop access for vehicles, because whenever we want to green, often with the greening, also spontaneous greening like this, comes after the demands of car parks and cars. So I was wondering if just occasionally, with the demands that we have, it could be possible to because you speak about this as if it's perfectly natural that things should be done that way around. Rather than because we can't possibly affect the water tightness of the car park. Personally, if I have to choose between poplar trees which have grown freely and anarchically and having a car park, I'd rather close the car park. That may be why I'm not working in the civil service and in the public administration. I would like to have the same reflexes you have. That goes beyond my powers. Here it's a private operation. Can these reflexes be changed, or mentalities? Yes, mentalities are changing, and sometimes the regulations do guide and the planning documents, but from that to closing down the car park for residents to allow a few poplar trees, it could make sense in terms of cooling down the town, but not necessarily in terms of uses in private operations like this. But it would be nice if we could have those same reflexes. It's not a reflex. It's a thought. I think that is a complicated subject. Well, we do have to take, but it's the garden is above the car park. It's a concrete slab. If we allow the poplars to grow, it can destroy the building. It's the slab which is disintegrated. The whole building can collapse, or the slab which can give way. So it's more a question of management. Or it might be that we didn't put enough money in so that the slab could be sturdy enough to resist the poplar trees. But you need a sufficient thickness of soil. We can't hear what's being said there because there's no microphone. But we're talking about an operation here which was 10 years ago, and it was interesting to see this because things don't always work out how they're planned. There are different rules on how we protect the frontages of buildings, and we still can't hear what the person's saying because she still doesn't, or he or she still doesn't have a microphone. If somebody could provide them with a microphone, we might be able to hear. Okay, it doesn't matter. So I'm saying that the key demand should be the vegetation. That should be the key priority. That's not the case yet. That's not in our mentalities. We haven't got there yet. The plant is always the last consideration. So when the plants come first, no, I agree, but what we're doing today in the authority is to raise these questions beforehand of what we can plant, what diversity of plants we want, and to see what standards we impose and what sort of spaces they are. Are they public? Are they private? Are they on a raised slab? Do they need to be watered or not? And we need to think about all these things increasingly early on in projects. But it's true that 10, 15 years ago, the issues were perhaps not the same. Perhaps the plant life was not the first demand. Now there are changes. There is a political will to change this in public spaces so that the vegetation becomes the priority, and we will try to make that the case. Hello. I have the impression we're talking a lot about standards, but not much about love for plants and living things. What struck me yesterday, I wasn't there this morning, but in all the projects and the people we met, was that the point in common between people was that people were in love with the gardens they were looking after, or that they were designing, and that was the key to the success in these green spaces and the cohabitation between the buildings and the plant life. And we had another visit to a site where we weren't talking about the soil at all. It was just a project which was imposed on a space which had never really worked, and where trees have already been replaced several times without actually asking ourselves the question of what the reason is for the fact that the vegetation isn't flourishing in this space. And this is going to be the fourth operation in this space without actually changing anything. And how long do we keep on wasting plants and not taking account of living things? And it's always humanity that prevails over nature. But what can we do to allow this nature to flourish? These are more, I think, questions. And it was on Stalingrad, Place Stalingrad, the square. There are no gardens without gardeners. So regarding the fourth visit, we were there yesterday morning. We were talking about this, and during that time on social media, there were a lot of images of flooding, and we didn't say anything. Does that mean that by the afternoon everything had been cleared? Yes, it was extraordinary. Because the day before, have you prepared for this? It's not going to be possible to get through with the level of the water, but we decided that we would adapt. And everything, there was no more water left. There was still some soil in places, but really it was clean. There was very little trace. Even in the botanical gardens, we could walk through it. It was quite extraordinary. Any other questions or reactions? Just to reassure you about the place of vegetation on our strolls, that was what guided us on our stroll yesterday. That was the theme. I don't know if I managed to get across the poetry of what we saw, but in all the places that we shared during our visit yesterday afternoon, there was poetry, colour, scent, and also with the showers of rain, which always change the scent that there is in the air. That's all part of the charm of the walk we had yesterday. But really, it was the botanical aspect that was the common thread through our visit yesterday. And in each of the places, each of the species that we discussed, that was the case. And also perhaps for what is shown by this is that this is something we all feel profoundly about when we're talking about plants and gardens. And we were all on the same level yesterday, whereas the managers, the designers, everybody had their respective view and their attachment to the places. And that also explains how sensitive these things are when we're talking with residents, with inhabitants, and that is a relationship that needs to be constructed. Regarding the question of flooding and how it's managed, it's quite extraordinary. This is an area which had been flooded 12 hours earlier. And at the same time, we talked a lot about the lack of water. And in fact, we talked about protecting ourselves from the river, from the water, which had flooded, but flowed out again very quickly. And we talked a lot about the shortage, the lack of water, without necessarily finding the answer. Camille Forgeot from Bordeaux Métropole, I'd like to thank you for those reports on the walks, as we were unable to take part in the strolls. And it was really interesting to listen to you, and that also echoes what we heard in the workshops this morning. I had a question which is linked in with this, but also a comment. So I work at Bordeaux Métropole on cooling the metropolitan area, and our aim is to try to ensure that people, when there are heat waves, that even the most vulnerable people should be able to get out of their homes, go for a walk, get their shopping, find places that are cool, and should be able to find shade. On the strolls you mentioned, there were some very nice examples of continuity with these parks and lines of vegetation, notably on walk number 2 presented by François from Place Péberlan. Then through this garden, we see that you go through the garden of the town hall, but which is only open at one side. You can't actually walk through it because in fact you have to go around it if you want to walk around to the side. You can't walk through it. You can only walk in and then back out the same way. If we want to walk to Mériadeck, if we really want to, and then along the streets which you mentioned, the Cours du Maréchal Juin, which is very wide, and where there is also a greening operation which is being delivered. But there we walk in the sun because the trees have been planted in the middle of the road, and so there it's not easy to have the cooling effect. But who is the shade for here when the trees are in the middle? And in the future, how will we guide these planting choices? I understand that it's a need, but we do have to think about the use of these spaces and enable the population, especially the most vulnerable population, to get outside and to walk from point A to point B in a cool environment. So that's a comment and a question to see how we can resolve this equation.
So just a comment regarding what you said. We did observe in many different locations, despite the thinking, the reflection, the experience of landscapers, we can see spaces, areas where the user, the inhabitant, selects their path. And it's the goat path, shall we say? If the trees are there, if the trees are one side, and if they've got their usual pathway, they will go to the shade. They'll find the shade. So people will naturally walk in the shade when they're in the sunlight and it's hot. So where it's more pleasant, people will naturally gravitate towards that. So we've gone over time a little bit. So what I suggest that we do is move on to the next phase, which is the restitution, therefore, of our workshops this morning. So thank you to everyone for your contributions. So Suzanne, I'm the reporter for my workshop, Camille, and Flore. And that's 4 of us. So let's go through in order, shall we go? All right, you can start, and I'll speak last. There was little coherence in the wandering, but lots in the workshops. So Suzanne, first workshops for you. So sharing reflections and reviewing values. So I'll try and be fast. I'm going to restitute the workshop this morning, sharing our comments and defining values. And so the subject we're talking about is greening. And we do all agree that extensive greening is necessary, notably in terms of climate change. I'm too small. So regarding mitigating climate change, but also there won't be enough on it itself. We'll have to adapt our behavior, our lifestyles, etc. So this was discussed this morning, that greening will never be enough, and that's why we do want to repeat that, even if we are talking about the subject of greening. So the debates this morning in our workshop was principally, we're talking about 4 main subjects. So the first was data, objective data. How do we revise our values? There was a question around the compatibility between built heritage and greening, and also to close, discussing what's specific with UNESCO heritage cities. So the first subject is what data and what information can we draw on, and is there an exhaustive inventory of the green or an inventory of plants like there is of heritage architecture. So we were talking with our colleagues from Budapest, Krakow and Bordeaux. None of these 3 cities have an exhaustive inventory, but there's a great deal of measurements and of data that is being collected, and they're all very aware of how important this data is. the challenges with in terms of having this data. There are many reasons. For firstly, what do we actually talk about quantitatively, estimating where is there vegetation, and to be able to look at this through an objective lens, also in terms of reconciling people's views of this, because not everybody has the same approach, and if we don't have the same approach between members of the population, elected officials, technical divisions and services, and these different entities, and therefore there is this challenge. Once we understand what we're talking about, we need to reconcile these different uses or different approaches, and then a question of convincing those who are reticent regarding the need to act and to act fully. And then finally, there is the looking at choices and having strategic choices. And this was a subject that we discussed during the workshop. Everybody does agree that planting trees is an objective, but to what end exactly? Is it simply to reduce heat islands, and there are ways of planting that are more efficient or effective than others? We won't be able to do everything we want, so as the case with all policies, we will need to prioritize and identify the most important objectives to therefore have solutions that have the most impact. And in terms of participation of inhabitants, their involvement. This is considered as being very important in terms of collecting and updating data. Krakow showed us their public database of trees. There's an app. Budapest also has something very similar to this, but this is managed by an NGO. And these are examples of applications that are very interesting because they're very easy to use by the inhabitants, by users. And there's the list of all of the different trees in the city. And there is a difference between countries as well in terms of making data available. In France and in Bordeaux, they are open source data, but they're used by technical divisions and services managing, and rather less so by the inhabitants. And therefore, this is a living heritage. It needs to be updated constantly in terms of the inventory. There would be benefits to having a process that does involve the inhabitants of the city, because they're the first people who will be able to provide feedback. So regarding this first axis of the data, there's quite a good coverage of knowledge, but this is still developing. It's still it's underway, shall we say. And then there's a lot of the varied data we have, so we can also look at the initiatives that is taking place in other cities. The second axis was, how do we revise values? How do we define values? So in terms of, it's difficult to quantify, and often it's seen as being decorative, shall we say. And there is a genuine advantage in looking at the economic value of natural heritage. So the new city of New York, for example, has an inventory of all of the trees with a system for actually allocating a dollar value to the tree, looking at the systemic services it provides, whether regarding water, depollution of air, and they can actually look at the cost it would cost if the tree wasn't there anymore. What's the value of that? So there is actually a price, and therefore it might seem a bit contradictory to financially quantify the value, but I think in the world in which we live, it is also an efficient means of giving value, of allocating, ascribing value to these trees and plants. The city of New York also evaluates the price of vegetation in terms of real estate prices. That has an impact on all prices, but it's important to remember this. And there's also an increasing progressive understanding with regards to property developers in terms of greening and of green spaces, and there can be a competitive advantage, for example, in the case of office spaces, which are having difficulties at the moment, and therefore providing a quality environment using planting can actually be a way of increasing the value and the attractivity of real estate. Education in this, obviously something very important, and in terms of revising these values, and we have too many projects that fail because it's considered that it's going to be difficult to maintain, for example, because people consider that greening projects very quickly become dirty. They need a lot of maintenance, and therefore too often people choose not to green spaces with this. So it's also a question of education and educating young people as well to change people's habits and mores. There's also the question of when we're planting, we need to take into account is the fact that it will take 20, 30, several years later. So this should be taken into account by all of the stakeholders. Third axis is the compatibility between built and natural heritage. And this was discussed, and there was an agreement that there's no real incompatibility between built heritage and natural heritage. And over the last years, there's been a real evolution regarding people's perspectives or attitudes on this question and the compatibility of greenery and architecture. They are not considered as being problematic. And there was an example given by Paul Trouot of the Bordeaux Quays, where the values were totally changed, in fact, and it's a garden now, which it had not been for several centuries, ever been. And so heritage is always alive, it's always evolving, and therefore it's reconciling, or how do we reconcile the questions between these two types of heritage? And here we have the impression that history can sometimes be an easy excuse for people not to green, not to plant. So there can be other reasons, of course. There's the challenge in terms of feasibility of planting in town centres. There's not a lot of space, networks underground, and it can cost a great deal of money. The cost of maintenance, and this is a question everywhere, and we still have not managed to find a solution to this. There's the challenges around rules, legislation, the size of vehicles, fire services, and on sites, historical sites, the question of preserving large spaces for mass tourism, which is a fact of life. So all of these challenges need to be worked on and dealt with, but remembering what the strategic objectives are, and they are essential, they can guide strategies of planting. And then the last axis or subject that was discussed, and this is this the uniqueness of World Heritage cities, which are confronted like other cities with climate change, but they also have unique requirements. And the questions are they an advantage? Can we use them as a means of developing strategies for planting, different strategies for planting? And in the examples we had, it was quite difficult to say the unique aspects will create specific or very different strategies. In fact, on the contrary, what we're seeing is that strategies are converging, and this would be natural. And one of the other things is looking at how these strategies are implemented in town centres of heritage cities and how they can be pertinent to other cities and towns as well. UNESCO towns do have a very high value heritage. Heritage being it's an inheritance, in fact, and it's beautiful because it's shared. And the climate urgence means that we need to plant for any way possible, as quickly as possible. And we often forget what the strategic objectives are, which can ensure maximum impact of the planting schemes. And we also forget that these spaces should also bring people together, attract people, draw people in, and make people want to look after them. And therefore, there's the question of aesthetics, attractive. It's not an accessory being attractive. It's a heart of the strategy. And when we look at UNESCO towns, here once again is the question of what we could consider the beauty of our heritage, of our collective heritage, is a means of demonstrating that you can plant cities extensively and maintain a very appropriate and beautiful environment. Well, thank you very much indeed, Susan. So, workshop number 2, what are the uses, opportunities? So that's Flore. Okay, so in workshop 2, we had Nice, Luxembourg, and Bordeaux that were present with very rich exchanges between those present. So rather than giving you a synthesis of what was discussed, because we did agree to a great extent on our thoughts, and we have had the agreement from the other members of our workshop that do agree with our report. So the first question was, there is this social need to have comfortable external spaces. Is this legitimate? And this question was answered, yes, it is. It's a totally legitimate need. It's a social requirement. Both in terms of comfort and having comfortable outdoor spaces. So in terms of our senses, so it's a sensorial approach and factual, because measurable, quantifiable, in terms of temperature, noise, fluidity, etc. So this goes back to what discussed, having tangible indicators or indexes. But they are both necessary in public spaces to provide this level of comfort. In terms of greening and planting, it was said that we need to look or review the role and the place for planting. We didn't think, should we have quotas, should we have plans, but the fact that it's an objective, it's a collective objective, and therefore it must mobilize everyone in the territory, whether it be public or private actors. Obviously, planting, greening of spaces will potentially also limit uses that'll be deteriorated or lost entirely with planting, even if it does create new uses. But these uses, these lost uses, they need to be compensated. So this doesn't mean that they need to be found elsewhere or replaced in the same form, but they need to be compensated in terms of the services offered, collective installations, etc. So we had the example of cars, of drivers, versus public transport, which is free in Luxembourg. And this isn't reproduction of I can't have my car here, where can I put it? Private swimming pools in gardens versus public water. So once again, we find the need for water, but not quite identical. Private events, gatherings in a private space, which at times is a less green environment, a pool, a terrace, etc. How can these private groupings, can they be done differently? And then we had the question in terms of proximity and the needs, and how do we articulate these needs with green spaces and parks and gardens? So this was a question regarding proximity. And we were inspired by Luxembourg once again in 2024 now is having a reflection about the 24 quarters that make up the town. And these 24 quarters is how can each inhabitant find in less than 15 minutes by foot comfortably walking? How can they reach a comfortable space? So whether it be in terms of safety, security, there's a lot of different elements in this. And that means that these needs depend on the urban situation, environment, social, generational aspects of the presence, and being able to fulfill these needs within 15 minutes walking distance of any individual habitation. There's not one single answer to that question. And then we had the question of what are the potential functions that can be replaced or activities, etc., and what could we do to the detriment of something else, etc. Basically, how do we do when and how do we decide to green here and not there? And what was concluded here was that the priority is to work on reconquering space that's used by cars, by individual vehicles, which is probably the highest priority. And then once again, greening and planting here does lead to the question, quid the car? And everything else needs to be looked at. So when there's an opportunity, the question is this an opportunity to plant? With what restrictions, obligations? But is there an opportunity there? And this, whether it be around built-up areas, non-built-up areas, private, public, small, large, daily or exceptional usage scenarios. And what we concluded was that this question of greening and planting, it's a cultural question, and taking into account different cultures, acculturation, in terms of acceptability of the evolutive nature, because of the changes, there will be changes. It will continue to involve changes in usage, changes in users of public spaces. Thank you very much, Flore. So we have all covered a lot of similar subjects, I can see, and even if we did separate them in an arbitrary manner. And in our workshop with Jonathan, who was not available this afternoon, unfortunately, we are asking a question about what is authenticity and what are the values of vegetation in these sites and these UNESCO sites. And we realized whilst we spoke that it was not necessarily the priority. Notably in cultural heritage, architectural heritage sites, these the greening is not perceived in the same way in participating in this universal value. And we were talking about Bordeaux and Nice specifically. And finally, in Bordeaux, it's the stone that's promoted, and the urban plan of Bordeaux. When we look at this, we think of the quay sites, we look at the courtyards, the gates, doors, gardens, all of these spaces that are or are not planted. And in Nice, the situation is quite different because it is a holiday destination, should we say. And the public spaces for holiday tourism environments, which have shade and views, port, and it's a marina, in fact, more than the port, there for private boats. So even the mayor of Nice, there was no vegetation originally there. It was all built. It was completely mineral. So now we see that this idea of evolution and changes in sites and the role of vegetation in these sites in the UNESCO criteria appeared in 1972 convention, but we also worked on this with regards to the notion of historical urban landscapes some years ago, and we did try and introduce this idea of landscapes and planting. And one of the questions we asked ourselves was, how can we work on these public spaces without changing the city too much, keeping its soul, shall we say? And then this culture of authenticity. So what is authentic? Notably in a natural living green space with vegetation which dies and renews. The Jardin Public that we all know is not the Jardin Public that existed under Tournai or under Gabriel. So we all know this. The quays, the Bordeaux quays, were never designed or built to be a park. Since Roman times, there's never been a tree on the Bordeaux Quays. Today, it is a park, it's a garden. So this is steps, there's an evolution in changes in the evolution of our public spaces. And what we need to maintain in Bordeaux is its roads and squares where we can plant or not. And this is where we talk about these universal values and exceptional value of the site itself. So at the end of the day, we said, well, when and there's this action of greening cities, will it actually change the nature, the authentic nature and the universal value, there's exceptional use and universal value of a site? And we also asked whether these changes of usage, use types, would justify the changes. And we did, of course, in addition to these planting schemes, but look at the status of nature itself. And the idea that nature can actually be a factor in gentrification. So we concluded, in fact, that it's not nature itself, but it's an element of gentrification, almost certainly. And this was raised earlier, but it's a number of different factors that contribute to improving people's lives and lifestyles, which in turn leads to gentrification, and the proximity to nature is a component of this. It's not the only one, but it is one of them. And we also looked at, in terms of authenticity, the major themes in terms of the social divisions in cities and towns. We can see this in all European cities. There are tendencies of division, separation in terms of landscapes. Bordeaux typically, the northwest direction is where there are the most parks and the nicest neighborhoods. And then we had periods where we did try and develop to rebalance this space that was left for inhabitants. And I think a good example of this is the Bois de Boulogne and the Bois de Vincennes, which are parks that were designed by Alphand to balance access to green spaces around Paris. And now we have the Bois de Boulogne and the Bois de Vincennes, and the nicest neighbors are in Bois de Boulogne and not Bois de Vincennes. So there is this ongoing combat against natural gentrification, and then the public authorities that has the ability and the means, and I think the visit showed this yesterday, that goes to show that we have some neighborhoods where historically there has been no public park. And there are often industrial neighborhoods with polluted soils, like just La Bastide, Bordeaux North, the train station area. And we're rebalancing this and nature that's available to inhabitants. And this is something we found very important indeed. And we did not conclude that this would be problematic. On the contrary, because anything that valorizes a site, even if it never existed previously, but if it has no authenticity, so now I won't go on for too long, but the argument that consists of saying it's never been planted, therefore don't plant it, as a justification for not planting, is something that has not, we don't consider to be legitimate in this discussion. And authenticity is something that's legible to all and quickly, very quickly understandable, accessible, and shareable. So we come back once again to the idea of sharing. So in reality, I think that in our language, we have tendency to idealize authenticity to some extent by So for me, something that's authentic is 18th century Bordeaux. For me, it's Roman Bordeaux. For me, it's Bordeaux from Alain Juppé's time, and then others say, no, it's 1930s. So there's nothing to report there or restitute there. We're just going through history of a space with shared values and the heritage in it. It is a collective project, a social project. So the question finally is not about restituting or restitution or looking for some specific form of authenticity that never existed anyway, but more a question of having a number of values that allow one, and I'll close with this, to do the right thing in the right place. And the story of the right tree in the right place. But we had a bit of an epilogue on this with Didier Jeanjean, who was with us, about the question of having the right solar panel in the right place. And case by case, it's not necessarily case by case, because when you've got shared rules, often it's just common sense. You don't plant a tree in the courtyard of a private mansion. The garden is behind and not in front, so that's just a tradition. You don't plant a tree in the line of sight of a monument. These things seem quite obvious, but you can have vegetation that crawls into a perspective, that leaks into a perspective, shall we say. I'm not going to give you these specific recipes to follow, but this is a bit the idea, having these reflexes and these cultural norms. And then the last thing I wanted to say was, will we be changing our reflexes, the way in which we view this, because they are cultural, and so perception of is important. And in Western civilization, can we imagine that in 100 years there might no longer be traditional French gardens? Maybe we'll have kept one in Versailles, but nowhere else. And perhaps we'll have dry Mediterranean-style gardens with rocks and xerothemophilous plants. That will be the key word of these 2 days. And we'll have gardens that die in the summer, but that grow back in the winter, and vice versa. Perhaps then we'll have a completely different approach to our value system and the different definition of authenticity, depending on how we perceive our nature and the anthropology of nature. So these are the things we've been looking at and discussing in our talks. And so now for the last workshop, so I will try and go quickly here, because in fact on the last workshop this morning, this was workshop number 4, and so blockages and limits and reasons for success as well. So we were talking through these exchanges during our walks as well, and your different workshops, and nonetheless they did keep us busy all morning, so I'll try and report this back to you. So firstly, we were saying that we came to an agreement very quickly that this was a very complex challenge. It's not a binary challenge regarding culture, nature, heritage, trees, and it needed to be looked at in detail. So I'll just try and give you an overview. We did speak about the different conditions and then what prevents these projects, and then in quite a porous manner, and then how we can open this up. So in terms of conditions, there were several things that did come up as important points. So I'm going to be more pragmatic here. The fact, for example, the need of speaking and working differently moving forward to the 21st century, to have interdisciplinary, transversal views, to have designers, maintenance people, ecologists, engineers looking at these questions with all of these technical restrictions, and also looking at the community upstream, having more dialogue, things that have been identified as being preventing progress. We've had examples. So, for example, the architects and the fire services. Secondly, it was a question of having the necessity of reinforcing our expertise, all of us, and having a little bit more humility, learning learning more about our soils, what can be done, what can't be done in terms of actions, and maybe having a little bit more science, but also learning more, teaching more, sharing knowledge around the living organisms. And then thirdly, it was in terms of developing awareness, living with heat as well. And this was an important thing. And coming back to techniques and heritage and habits that perhaps we've lost. Another subject in terms of conditions was the vocabulary, terminology, and the lexicon of greening. That's maybe a bit narrow, and agreeing on terminology. What do we mean when we say greening? Is that too Is it too technical? And this is in this context of all of the wealth that living organisms can bring. And another major challenge was considering looking at different scales. So both in terms of project level and the restrictions on a specific given individual project. So it could be networks versus global strategies on a much larger scale. And as we mentioned, to have continuity, coherence, and identifying incoherencies. Here we're investing massive amounts of public money here to make the ground porous, and at the same time we're densifying aggressively. And the need to zoom in and zoom out on projects in terms of scale, in terms of time, history, memory, and a very strong desire to preserve heritage as in contradiction to rushing and planting as quickly as possible, so that even if we do need to organize quite fast. And then, as I said before, scales of time and project durations, and the systemic nature of these challenges, greening, and this was mentioned as well in terms of preserving biodiversity, water, of course, as well. And then the last condition as well, before we move on to things that are blocking progress, well, there is the question of political courage and owning positions and assuming responsibility for those in what's quite a polarized environment, political environment. Now, in terms of things that are preventing progress, shall we say, and some levers, so the fire service is very interesting exchange with them around the restrictions and the requirements they have to save lives. And also, once again, and sorry not to repeat myself here, but the fact that there are possibilities for some compromise, to make some changes here, and to attenuate the restrictions of these rules, but that does entail discussions and exchanges. And floor, as you were saying, soils, what cannot be seen beneath the surface. So this is very important. There's very sterilized, dense soils under cities, but there are also technical solutions here and natural innovations as well, low-tech innovations that can be applied, renewing soils, with examples of Colombes and Nantes. Networks as well, technical solutions that are possible for planting with networks in towns. I can't remember which town we cited. I can't remember. It'll go into the written version. In Colombes, I think, with the having cohabitation between gas networks and trees, and the trees can actually give alerts to gas leakages, for example. And yes, so we're reconciling these different challenges In terms of management and maintenance, this is a real challenge here, and we see this. It's a real subject, and the need to um, have spaces that are less clean, perhaps less perfectly organized. For example, not raking up dead leaves immediately because they do actually constitute a nutrition for the soil, and also with the architects of France and working with them, opening up and working more collaboratively with them, and having a dialogue as upstream as possible regarding projects, new projects, and finding subjects together, and the mobilization in terms of the different levers when it comes to private spaces, private property. Not that we had a great deal of time to go into depth on this question, but how can private land, private real estate be leveraged as well, and in terms of the attention to landscapes on a large scale, and working on the intensification of these different lines as being part of heritage. And to conclude, we agreed, therefore, that there is a real need in terms of uses, and with sites where there are a lot of different challenges for people need to have mobility, converging together, groups, in terms of mental health, for example, and that planting and greening is one of the conditions of and improving people's mental health in an environment and in a hospitable, sorry, and greening to cool, of course. It is an extremely effective means of this, but in terms of cooling, you can't consider only greening and planting. You need to soils and living soils are almost very important. Bioclimatics are very important for this, whether it be in terms of architecture, urban planning, water as well, and they need to be taken into account as well. The preservation of existing trees is above, with the example of Pornic, which implemented a cell that of heritage landscape gardeners and artists who the strength of examples was cited as being extremely important, and that's being worked on to illustrate the different operations and levers that can be activated. And then finally, as a conclusion, that to have a transversal approach with culture and nature, to have a heritage ecosystem. So it really did give a sort of desire to move forwards after this workshop and to progress in many different ways.
So, are there any questions? Anne-Laure has the microphone, just in case anybody has a question. And then Emilie will allow the partner cities to give their presentations. Then we'll have a conclusion and a discussion with Luc Gagnon, Didier Jeanjean, and Céline Papin, in charge of international relations, and Baptiste Maurin, who has joined us in charge of heritage. I wanted to ask Manuela what she thought before we let anybody else speak. No tricky questions from Manuela. So we must conclude once again that everything was perfectly clear. Brilliant. Therefore, we are going to move to hand over to the cities. So here is your microphone. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to introduce myself for those who I haven't been lucky enough to meet in recent days. I'm Émilie Courbin, Project Officer for Urban Heritage at the OVPM, the General Secretariat for the Organization of World Heritage Cities. I'll go very quickly for those who aren't familiar with it. The aim is to allow our member cities to speak. So we are a political platform of mayors from a certain number of World Heritage cities. We have existed for 35 years. We currently, I believe, have 116 members from Asia, Pacific, North America, Europe, Africa. And our aim is at the OWHC to help cities to work together individually to understand the complexity of the challenges they face as World Heritage cities, but also to guide them in achieving their Sustainable Development Objectives, the UN SDG, and also the Quebec Roadmap, which is a document which is intended to be innovative in its method for working collaboratively, a document of collective intelligence, if I may say, which helps the cities to work together as a network on themes which have been defined in relation to the particular situation or concern they are addressing. So to identify the different themes, there is one theme which is prioritized and which is proposed to the member cities to work together on this and to collaborate to work on concrete solutions and to come up with urban projects that reconcile the human, the urban, and the environment, which is all very good because that has also been the theme of the past couple of days. Yesterday morning, for those who were already here, was the link between the city culture and the urban and the environment, And the collaborative network managed by the city of Bordeaux has been working on the theme of greening to cool down the city and has had a certain number of cities taking part, which were mentioned by the Mayor of Bordeaux yesterday morning. And with us for these 2 days, we have the cities of Luxembourg, Krakow, Budapest, Nice, and Lyon. I haven't met anybody from Lyon. If there's anybody from the municipality of Lyon, I'd like to invite them as well. So the cities, if I could invite one spokesperson at least from each of the cities I just mentioned, so that we can allow you to speak about the impression you have had of these 2 days. Or if not, I'll bring you the microphone, as you prefer. So I'm going to call you up onto the stage to introduce yourselves, to explain how your city or why your city wanted to take part in this collaborative network of the city of Bordeaux, and whether the exchanges of these 2 days have been meaningful for you. If you'd like to present the specific questions regarding your case, or if perhaps and if you have any particular expectations and whether your expectations have been satisfied during these 2 days. If I could invite you, and you can speak in English. And for the representatives of the cities from Hungary and Poland will be speaking English. So if you want a headset for the interpretation, they are here on either side of the room. Feel free to take a headset. Nobody needs headsets. They can all understand English. In that case, I'll hand back the microphone. And at any time in the room, if you want to speak or say anything, please feel free. And perhaps at the end, we'll invite people from the city of Bordeaux to explain whether what has been said by these different cities in France and abroad have provided some fresh insights for you that you hadn't seen hitherto. So is there a volunteer to begin? Or in order, should we begin with Krakow? Merci beaucoup. Je suis un éclaireur de musique. Je travaille pour la municipalité, l'autorité verte de la municipalité de Cracovie. Je suis architecte paysagiste. Je vous remercie déjà pour l'occasion de venir ici à Bordeaux échanger avec tant d'experts. J'ai beaucoup apprécié l'accueil que j'ai reçu ici. Merci beaucoup. J'espère que nous pourrons mettre en œuvre les différentes choses qu'on a vues ici dans notre ville. Je souhaitais partager quelques idées avec vous sur la gestion des arbres que nous avons mis en œuvre à Cracovie, car ce matin, dans notre groupe, nous avons beaucoup échangé autour des inventaires d'arbres et de plantes dans nos villes respectives. Would it be possible to have the slides on the screen from the computer here? Et donc à Cracovie, nous avons un document spécifique, directive pour l'aménagement et la gestion des espaces verts. Et toute la ville est cartographiée avec ces espaces verts. Et nous pouvons cliquer. On peut donc cliquer sur les objets ici et on a différentes informations parmi ces informations, et là on partage aussi nos connaissances sur l'espace avec d'autres services de la municipalité, de la collectivité pour coordonner nos travaux sur la voirie, sur les espaces verts et les investissements. Et donc c'est sur une échelle plus importante. Quasiment tous les espaces verts appartenant à la collectivité sont renseignés ici sur la carte. Par ailleurs, il y a aussi une approche plus micro. Je vais vous montrer la carte. Ici. Ici, vous avez la carte de l'intégralité de Cracovie et les points représentent les différents arbres. Je vais agrandir. Ce n'est pas le même clavier qu'en Pologne, excusez-moi. Par exemple, ici, vous voyez vraiment spécifiquement le site UNESCO avec la place du marché principal, où on souhaite intégrer davantage d'arbres en utilisant le budget participatif. Et on s'est inspiré ici de la place autour de la cathédrale ici à Bordeaux. Et ici, il est possible de cliquer sur chaque arbre là, vous avez la photo de l'arbre. Ici, c'est un arbre, un sujet plutôt jeune. Et toutes les informations sur l'arbre. Et on se sert également de cette appli pour échanger avec nos entreprises qui s'occupent de l'entretien des arbres. Ici, on peut indiquer les travaux à effectuer sur les arbres. Et aussi, il y a une base de données pour la planification des différentes interventions, des traitements sur les arbres. Et nous avons 76 parcs, 2500 hectares d'espaces verts et 2000 hectares de forêts urbaines. Et donc, c'est plus facile pour nous d'utiliser cette application pour la gestion de tous ces arbres. Et on intègre 2500 à 3000 arbres chaque année pour qu'il y ait tous les arbres dans l'appli. L'appli sert aux salariés de nos contractants, de nos entreprises, mais nous avons différents projets aussi qui ciblent les habitants de Cracovie. Ici, dans le cadre du projet LIFE, Urban Green, ici, vous avez la carte des espaces verts de Cracovie. Et les habitants peuvent cliquer sur un arbre et ainsi afficher des informations sur les plantes, les arbres, la végétation. Par exemple, ici, le parc Krakowski, on clique sur l'arbre et on a le numéro de l'arbre, sa localisation et aussi les services fournis par cet arbre. On a 62 000 arbres qui figurent dans ce projet et on travaille pour intégrer l'intégralité des arbres et là, c'est à destination des habitants de Cracovie. Et merci beaucoup. Thank you for that excellent example. We were talking earlier about inventories for greening, and this really is a practical example of what this sort of thing can look like, and also the participatory dimension of this. And over to you, Budapest. Hello. Je souhaiterais également donner mes remerciements pour la possibilité de venir vous voir ici. Je suis agnostique à la poste de Budapest en Hongrie. Je travaille pour la ville de Budapest dans le service d'urbanisme. Je suis urbaniste et architecte et je souhaitais vous raconter 2 projets à Budapest sur la végétalisation du centre historique de la ville. Tout d'abord les quais du Danube. La ville a décidé de procéder à une végétalisation des quais, car on se retrouve face aux mêmes défis que Bordeaux, les inondations, les îlots de chaleur en été aussi, mais aussi, c'est très important. Notre maire de Budapest dit toujours qu'on doit œuvrer ensemble pour Budapest. Budapest est très engagé dans une voie de participation citoyenne. Et donc, on a mené tout d'abord un projet pilote l'année dernière, un essai pour voir comment ça allait fonctionner si on plantait des arbres le long des quais de Danube, là où il n'y avait jamais d'arbres auparavant. Et aussi, aujourd'hui, ces quais sont un peu comme une autoroute urbaine dévolue aux voitures et au parking. Et ce serait vraiment un gros changement de fermer ces quais aux voitures. Et donc, ce serait vraiment une situation très conflictuelle. Et aussi, nous avons un accord avec plus d'une vingtaine d'ONG, y compris les groupes qui représentent les conducteurs, les automobilistes, les travailleurs, les cyclistes. Et donc, on a des contacts avec beaucoup d'ONG et d'organisations. Et ce projet pilote que nous avons organisé l'année dernière a consisté en une période d'essai du printemps jusqu'au mois d'octobre. Ça a très bien fonctionné. Nous avons organisé beaucoup d'ateliers, nous avons fait beaucoup de communication. Il s'agissait vraiment juste d'une fermeture provisoire des quais avec des arbres et des plantations dans des bacs sur les quais. Mais maintenant, nous avons un projet à plus long terme aussi et nous avons pris toutes les conclusions, les leçons tirées de l'essai de l'année dernière. Pour préparer nos projets à plus long terme, on a décidé qu'on pouvait planter 8 arbres en pleine terre sur les quais. Et donc aujourd'hui, le défi, c'est de planter ces 8 arbres le long des quais, de les observer. Et puis on verra lorsqu'il y aura les travaux de construction à plus long terme qui vont être lancés d'ici 3 ou 4 ans. À ce moment-là, les arbres seront déjà établis, en place, et entre-temps, ces arbres pourront pousser. Et donc, l'autre projet que je souhaitais vous présenter, c'est le projet rue Seine de Budapest. Je ne sais pas si vous le savez, mais l'espérance de vie des habitants de Budapest est 5 ans de moins que pour les habitants de Vienne. Et ce n'est pas juste une question, je pense, de végétation, mais c'est un des facteurs qui peut jouer. Et donc, l'approche des rues saines est basée sur une approche britannique conçue par Lucy Sanders, expert en matière de circulation automobile, qui est aussi experte en matière de santé, qui a combiné ses connaissances des transports et des soins de santé et a établi 10 indicateurs pour mesurer dans quelle mesure nos rues sont saines pour les habitants, pour les utilisateurs. Ce sont des indicateurs très simples. Est-ce qu'il y a trop de bruit? Est-ce que c'est pollué? Est-ce qu'il est facile de traverser pour les piétons de traverser la rue? Et selon ces informations, ces indicateurs, on peut mesurer l'existant, la situation existante dans nos rues et on peut prioriser les rues les moins saines où il faut des actions prioritaires. Et heureusement, l'année dernière, à fin novembre, nous avons reçu un financement. Il y a eu un appel à projet et avec un financement pour Budapest. Et maintenant, nous pouvons obtenir. C'est maintenant les différents quartiers ont des financements pour demander de participer à ce projet sur les rues saines. Et donc, les différents quartiers vont préparer leur projet pour adopter cette approche dans le cadre du projet de la rue ou des rues saines. Once again, that brings up a lot of things that were mentioned in the workshop this morning and yesterday with this transversal approach, taking account of, for example, traffic and health, but also involving the drivers themselves, car users themselves. And in Budapest, they're working with a lot of NGOs representing different groups in these areas which touch upon matters of public health. There's also the question of perception indicators. And so what are the measures we need? What are the indicators we need? How do we measure them? To have the right tools to measure these different aspects. And there's also the question of the time scale between the things which are immediate, urgent, or the things for which we need a longer term view. And over to you, perhaps Luxembourg now to continue. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much also. I'm Francesca Mutter. I come from the city of Luxembourg, and I'm an architect, and I work in the town planning department, mainly on the design and planning of public spaces. I would like to thank you for these 2 days of discussions where we have encountered a lot of issues that we have in all our different cities. Even if we have much lower temperatures in summer, we are still facing this issue of greening in the historic center of the city and even more generally in the whole of the center of Luxembourg. And we see that people's perceptions are changing. And in Luxembourg, we're doing a lot of grassroots participation because these aren't just spaces that we're creating them for the people who live in the city, for the people who will be using these spaces. And so we attach very great attention to making sure we have those discussions with the inhabitants. And we were talking, I mentioned earlier a study we started this year, and 2024 will be the year of the 24 districts that make up Luxembourg. And the idea of analysing the 24 districts and seeing what the strengths and weaknesses are is an important project. So we're starting out from a relatively basic beginning, doing mapping of the key aspects of the city centre, in these districts of Luxembourg City. So things such as bus stops, schools, public spaces, playgrounds, all the different sports facilities, shops. So this is something we're analysing district by district with the idea of the 15-minute city, which is 15 minutes on foot, to try to make sure there's easy access for pedestrians, to make sure that people can get to many of the amenities within 15 minutes on foot. But if that walk isn't pleasant, it's more difficult to manage. So we're listing all of this. We also have mapping, maps where we can see all the points where the places where there are trees which are planted. And we're trying to get a large amount of data, and with that data, the aim ultimately is to be able to show these maps to the population, to go out into each of the 24 districts and show what is going on there, and also try to see with them what the things are we need to work on in more detail, whether we need to do more research on certain issues. We may see what suggestions we get, and or may realize that nothing needs to change. So to see what the perceptions are of people, and on the basis of those perceptions, to try to create something in relation with the inhabitants. That work will be done not only among ourselves, among the architects and the people, but we will also be trying to get sociologists to work with us on this research, and also take account of the technical aspects. We've talked several times about the fire brigades for different infrastructures that can pose issues. So to try to find a consensus together. And we're preparing these maps, then we'll go out with the maps into those 24 districts to try to get people to express themselves in small activities to see what their perceptions are, what they feel, and then to come up with plans to see how in the future we can redevelop all these spaces, or not, if it's not necessary. That will depend on the results, the findings of the study, of the survey. That will be the final decision. And having said that, regarding the projects we have already conducted, we've also talked about the fact that very probably we will need to change certain uses of certain squares. We have a public square in Luxembourg which gives a very beautiful panoramic view of the city, the Place de la Constitution, Constitution Square. In Luxembourg, Luxembourg City cars do take up a lot of space, and this square is magnificent with its panoramic view, but currently, or at least until a few months ago, it was just one big car park with cars parked all over the place, which sort of spoiled the appearance of this square as a place for going for a walk. And now, after many years, this wasn't something we were able to do overnight. We've been trying to remove the car parks, despite the fact that local people are used to being able to park there. And we've even seen in the mentality of people that things are starting to change. People are starting to want to take back spaces as pleasant places to go, because not everybody in the city centre can afford to have a garden. Real estate property is very expensive. in Luxembourg, so people can't always have private gardens for themselves. They're quite rare. And so we want to try to enhance these public spaces so that people can go there for a walk or to get out in the fresh air. So we've tried to remove the cars from this space. There'll be a number of the short-term initiatives on the square, activities, just to show people that we can make a different use of squares like this. And there's a competition being organized for the greening of the square, and we're currently looking. It's a competition, and we're currently trying to choose the winner. So that's a big project that we're handling at the moment. Thank you very much once again for all the discussions here. Thank you very much. I'd like to also draw your attention to the fact that in yesterday morning's discussion, we highlighted the lack of data we often had to really assess the impact of greening initiatives in public spaces when we were talking. So perhaps it can be interesting to have, if you have that rich data about the 24 districts of the city, that should provide you with impact criteria to assess the different initiatives. So that could be a good example. And Julie from Nice, perhaps. I wanted to talk about the network of World Heritage Cities. Nice was listed in 2021. So after a process of just 7 years, which is in fact shorter than many, and throughout that application period, networks were very important because we needed to understand what other cities had done before us, especially those who had been listed most recently with similar assets. Bordeaux was one example that we identified, but there are different sites around the world which are similar. So we looked to European or other networks to try to get an insight into the process. And once the listing was done, once you reach the management phase, when you are an elected representative for that site, or when you're having to manage the different aspects, the many different aspects, there we're always looking for examples of good practices and inventive things which have been tried in other places, or sites which have encountered risks before. We have, like climate change, to try to learn the lessons from how other people have reacted. So all that networking to find examples of good or bad practices to try to avoid perhaps making the same mistakes other people have made is very important. We also see that even in the association of the French World Heritage Sites, or in the other associations in Europe, we've learned a lot from all of them, and we learn things not only in terms of sharing knowledge or objective data, how to get the data, how to find it, through participatory methods, by surveys, studies, algorithms, all sorts of different things that the engineers can create. And also how we define, once we are listed and when we are defined as a shared common asset of humanity, we have all defended that application in our relations with lots of different people. We have defined the essence of the site and its values. So everybody who is listed, and there are 1,200 listed sites of all different kinds, each with their own views, their own cultures, or are currently working on different aspects of this. And it really is very, very interesting. And for us, very in practical terms, on a day-to-day basis, this enables us not only to see if we can't do things differently based on the examples of other cities. So it really is very interesting having these networks to get the information we would not have got if we had just stayed alone, working on our own. And I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to everybody who makes an effort for these networks to exist. The associations, the participants here, like Bordeaux, which has accepted to undertake this effort. As we've just been discovering the organization of the past couple of years, I've been taking part in webinars on commercial fabrics, the shops in cities, all sorts of different subjects. And in all these cases, I found it very interesting to be able to take part and to discuss with people, whether in video conferences or even on site with the actual examples that we can see with our own eyes. Obviously, we were talking earlier about the snowball avalanche effect. You have one example and then all sorts of other things that follow which come to mind. And it's much richer than to see things than taking part in video conferences. But even video conferences aren't so bad. And it's a way of seeing, of giving the sites a chance to show their GIS, their project examples, their inventories. So it really is very, very rich. And there you are. I'll just stick there and stick to that and say thank you. Perhaps before we hand over to the floor, Anne-Laure, did you want to react as coordinator of the Collaborative Network of Bordeaux on perhaps your feedback on this collaboration? Yes. I'd like to thank all of you, because this wouldn't work if we didn't have all these different parts. First of all, the Organization of World Heritage Cities that provides the framework, and the team which has driven us, stimulated, boosted us, Michael and Emily, and then the group of local experts who have you discovered today, for some of them, who have acted as rapporteur, and others yet who I have called upon and who all accepted to take part and who were very interested in this. And it's almost a demonstrator, an example showing that we can work more horizontally, transversally, through collaboration with each other. I think this notion of a collaborative network really is a term that has a great future ahead of it on several scales. I note that there are the webinars which correspond to a certain need for exchanges and discussions and encounters, quick encounters, and it's better, however, to see each other in person, to eat together, and to talk together in the field. Now we're going to have to continue to put all these things together to be able to share all that more widely. And thank you once again to the elected officials as well who've accepted to take part and to accompany all this. I think it really is very positive, and I'm not disappointed at all. And I didn't find encounter any particular difficulties. Thank you very much. I'm now going to open up to the whole of the room, to any people working for the City or Metropolitan Authority of Bordeaux, if you would have liked to say anything about these 2 days, or if you have any questions for the representatives of the other cities present here, if this has opened up any new prospects or perspectives for you, and for the rest of the room, and in particular our speakers from yesterday morning, if you have any new questions or any new insights, any things you'd like to add on the basis of what has been said since, or any other comments that you would like to make, and they will be welcome. Thank you very much, Céline Papin, Deputy Mayor in charge of International Relations. I have a more particular question for Luxembourg. I was there just 2 days ago, by coincidence, but I'd be particularly interested in your participative citizens' efforts and one particular feature of Luxembourg. But when you address this question, Luxembourg is a city which has many commuters, cross-border commuters who come to work there, who don't live there, and I wondered how you take that notion into account. I'm also in charge of territorial cooperation at the Bordeaux Metropolitan Authority. So I was wondering how we incorporate the perception or the vision of the users of our spaces, of these World Heritage spaces, even the people who are not residents there. When you talk about participation, grassroots participation, that is difficult to manage always. At the beginning, when we started this, the idea was more for the design of squares which already existed. So it was a fairly classical approach to participation, with the mayor sitting down with his or her councillors, and the audience, the local people, invited to take part in a very traditional way of organising participation. But very quickly we realised that, as very generally this sort of process is over a period of a year, let's say, and we try to see the inhabitants 3 or 4 times to come up with a common project. What happens, unfortunately, is when we begin the participation, along the way, we have people who drop out, so inhabitants who stop coming to the meetings, new people who join in, and there's always this issue of this turnover. We have people who say, I wasn't there the last 2 times, but I want my idea to be applied. So these are issues that we do encounter, and we try to extend our horizons in this participation now. We avoid doing this just in the form of meetings in a traditional format, and really try to have different actions that we can implement in the district. So going for walks through the district to try to reach the whole population, because as you said, we have a lot of cross-border commuters who come to work in Luxembourg who don't reside there in the evening, and a lot of people who come to work at the week in Luxembourg during the week but go back home at weekends. And so that really is the issue for us, of trying to reach as broad a range of people as possible, with the workers, the young people as well, children too, or the inhabitants themselves, or older people as well, senior citizens. And it's by trying to have different types of action and activities, so going for walks through the districts, going to try into schools to see the children, to see their perceptions of what they're doing. And we want to create playgrounds also to have children who can take part in, contribute to the contribution of the playground. It's not just doing that among adults. So there's different times where things we're trying to set up. We also tried to have sorts of after work sessions where people can come to join us for discussions with us. And then another way of doing this is through online surveys, to try to, often with simple questions, because that's what's important. We often tend to ask questions which might be a bit too specific and the people can't really grasp. And so to try to ask the right questions which are simple and effective, because people don't necessarily want to spend 3 hours in front of their computer answering a survey. And it really is seeing what sort of participation we want, and also for workshops where we can allow people to express themselves with panels, like with a question like, just what is my district, to get the feedback from them and to allow people to work with us. Thank you. Perhaps we could take 1 or 2 more comments before we move on. I think we had someone from the city of Paris as well who was here. I don't know if they would like to. No, apparently not. Anything else? In that case, time is moving on, we can perhaps move on and to the. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Luc Gagnon from the consulting group of the Organization of World Heritage Cities, who works with us on the implementation of this roadmap and on the content which will be presented at the Cordoba Symposium, and who will also be. So thank you, Emilie. And Didier Jeanjean.
While we get settled in, I'd just like to thank you for being here at this late hour, and I think it is a testament to the interest everybody has in these discussions that have taken place over the last 2 days. And Laura, I'm looking at you, so please do tell me if I start going too fast or if my accent becomes incomprehensible. Didier Jeanjean, well, thank you very much indeed, and for participating in this brief conclusion, because we're reaching the stage of conclusions now. We've got about 15 minutes now, and then we can get your colleagues to join us, and if anybody else has any other comments to make. What I found interesting over the last 2 days was the knowledge we have and the understanding we have of the challenges with which we're faced and what needs to be done. We're aware of the problems, and in addition to that, we're aware of the solutions in terms of our expertise, whether it be a municipal level, etc. And we have living proof of this. That said, it's difficult to do this as fast as we'd like to and deliver these projects as fast as we'd like to. So therefore, I wanted to ask you about, I remembered that yesterday I did note down a sentence that your mayor said during his open remarks. He cited a report on a citizen reflection, and this, I thought it was very important what he said. It was, citizens are very clear, living in a green city, they'd rather live in a green, livable city than a than a heritage but unlivable city. So we're aware of this, and we're aware of the solution. So that said, you are responsible for a lot of this, and you have a delegation from the town, from the mayor, and what your responsibilities are. Between us, we've spoken the last couple of days in terms of the obstacles, the technical obstacles. I'd like to hear what you have to say, and I think the people in the room would be interested to hear regarding political obstacles that need to be overcome. Okay, well, just a little question for you. Well, to say I'm very emotional here in front of these prestigious people, notably after these wonderful 2 days we've had, and also you're aware of how lucky I am, because since I've been elected, the subjects we've been talking about are those that I deal with from morning to night for the last 4 years. I've got 2 years left. And you could also understand the pressure under which we are, because it all exists, everything's possible almost, one could say. But there are contradictions, there are sometimes objectives that themselves are contradictory, and amongst those, you note, and I don't think it's by any chance, one, and this is the political challenge. And I'll say in terms of political communication, because for me, politics is a positive thing, but among the challenges we're faced with in public opinion, there are some cliches that are still very popular. And when we read media, when we read the news, we see this cliche of the inhabitants don't want to green their streets, that they don't want to agree that efforts are necessary, that small businesses still imagine towns full of cars. And I don't think that is the case. Unfortunately, for political ends and for political communication, sometimes they will have opposition. For example, at the moment in Bordeaux, we're pacifying 2 very major streets at the moment. And we're faced with a political opposition that says that the local businesses will be penalized with the pacification of these roadways. But to be able to think about greening streets, we have to go through pacification of streets. It's not a question of being anti-car, but for years now, the car has been the priority. If we want to get rid of something, there's not much else we can get rid of than the car. And the mayor really does insist on this. It's not a question of hunting cars or getting rid of cars. It's a question of sharing the public space with the different types of mobility and different types of users. And when possible, thinking about re-greening or greening. So this political communication, it's always quite emotional. It's good for writing articles. People want to read this, especially when the titles are a bit provocative. And this contributes to giving this idea that we're not ready. When I say we, I mean the inhabitants of a town. And for me, this is one of the challenges. It's a pity because it doesn't help the cause that we should all be aligned with. And I like to say that as a young person, I'm a young politician. I'm a young, for a politician, I'm young, if not as a man. And before coming into the ring, I always wanted to have I was always interested in constructive politics, and I really am very open to other visions, different perspectives, but in a constructive view of the new urban environment. And we see here Krakow, Budapest, Luxembourg, Nice, all of these different horizons, and what we see that we're all driven by the same objectives. We all have the same goals. So it's not a question of some local political quarrel. Some ecologist that just arrives in Bordeaux. It goes way beyond this. It's nothing to do with dogmatism. It's nothing about sterile politics, but it's about having a vision of the city. And so perhaps I'm a little bit naive or a bit utopian in this manner, but I believe that there should be a vector for construction together, building together, rather than cliches. And at lunchtime today, you said yesterday you gave an example of how open citizens are to these initiatives and having more greenery. And we were confronted with a situation where you had to explain to citizens why you can do as much as you'd like. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yesterday evening, after our long day, I had another meeting to end my day, and this was with a local neighborhood council, and we were talking in this. I'm looking for the person who was speaking, but I can't see her. There she is, Marilise. And Marilise is running this meeting, and we announced that in these large avenues, we would not be able to green their avenue and plant their avenue. And I arrived at the end of the meeting, and the residents came to see me and said, Monsieur Jeanjean, you need to find a solution. You don't understand. Our apartments in the summer it's 40 degrees. You don't understand, Mr. Jeanjean, that if you don't plant, we're going to have to put in air conditioning into our apartments. And they're explaining to me what I spend my entire life preaching, that it's indispensable to plant and have more greenery in their avenue, which goes to show that people are waiting for this now. People want this, and I think the reality is this now. And that's an excellent example. It's not necessarily the public. It's not necessarily the citizens. So moving along in this idea in terms of political communications and exploring the questions of what's holding you back, but what levers do you have, or what posture can you take or adopt in order to get past these problems and challenges? Well, I think the first thing is information, is communication. It's desire and information. Um, Giving the example of the maps we were looking at, and it really is very interesting indeed. In Bordeaux, we've been looking at doing maps with a more entertaining map, shall we say, with an inventory. We already have an inventory, but I'd like to have a map that's more entertaining with a before and after, um, to show the different services that are provided by nature, so that people want this more, that they see the benefits of this. Because when we see the images of the quays, and this wasn't us that did this, so we can't take credit for this. We didn't do this project. But when you see the quays or with the boats in the 1980s, when you see the car parks, and everybody is over the moon and delighted with the improvement here. When you see Pays Berlin, Place de la Victoire, when you see all of these, they were just car parks. The courtyard of the town hall was just a car park. When you see the photos, you can only want this. Nobody wants to go back to what it was like before. And I think the first lever here is to generate desire. I believe in joyful ecology. I think in positive ecology. Believe in positive ecology, and I think therefore people need to desire this and inform people. People need to understand and be informed. And I cannot have just a political program. I explained that why, but I need to explain that NGOs, the groups, ICOMOS, OVM, etc., WHC, sorry, architects, landscapers have already considered this, thought about this, and explain the methodology, and show the benefits, communicate the benefits to people. So when we look at examples that do give this desire, to provoke this desire, and we can show that there's the panoply of different solutions that are possible, and this is what I think can make the difference. And this is how we're doing it in Bordeaux now. Clear communication and convincing examples. They show the benefits of what can be achieved. Exactly. And perhaps Madame Papin or Monsieur Maurin would like to say a couple of words regarding this question and regarding the political obstacles or the postures that are adopted. Well, thank you very much. And I think Didier gave a very explicit answer. And I think one of the political obstacles I see is time. Because what's quite unique with the subject of greening is that it takes time to see the results and for it to really be there. And political time scales are not always the time scale of projects and nature. And I think this really is one of the challenges that we're faced with, to really do this fast. This is why we have these tactical projects, to be able to try and move a bit faster so that people can see what it will be like, what the projects are, and give them a taste of the town of tomorrow, the city of tomorrow, the future. And if we go even faster, so I think that's what I'd say is also a major element. And this question of time becomes increasingly political when you look, and once you start a deployment, how long does it take to actually start producing results, tangible results? We see this in Didier's examples for some spaces. From the beginning of our mandate, we were very proactive. At the very beginning, we can have planting specimens that are quite small, but still have some inhabitants who are a bit dubious, and very quickly, in fact, just months afterwards, 2 or 3 years later, people do start to have a different perspective, a different view of this. And there's yes, what you were right, but it takes time to see the results of the projects, and a political mandate in France is 6 years, in others it's even less, which makes it even harder. It's 4 years in Montreal, in Quebec. So this is also something that has an impact. Well, thank you very much, for Mr. Maurin. For any comments on from your perspective? Firstly, what I'd like to say is regarding what you said earlier. Beyond the obstacles and challenges, the first lever is what Didier didn't say, but is what we does with the mayor, and it's having political courage, and it's being ready to confront a perception that is not necessarily that we have in terms of planning a neighborhood, for example, and knowing, one, how to explain, to inform, and secondly, to be able to project tomorrow's comfort, shall we say, to envisage this. So political communication is a challenge and a lever when it's done properly, when you're able to do this and project a project of society that everybody can see the benefits of. In terms of teaching, in terms of learning, Didier's policy structures the evolution of the city. So we're talking about heritage, authenticity. This is something we're building, a new authenticity, in fact, and we're building this authenticity of a shared heritage of a city which is allied universal values that's been recognized with the universal value it's looking to build for tomorrow, and to be able to avoid debates around this universal value, whether it be the urban planning, etc., and heritage, of course, and the ability to create a new natural heritage that the people of Bordeaux can take ownership of. We do this from young age, and in public policies that I work in terms of culture, art, we have reintegrated scientific culture as well as being one of the pillars that allows us to see a future society, and a very strong axis of this. And Didier works on this with the botanical gardens, with our museums, and the way in which we integrate and teach our young people that they live in an urban space, but they are just stakeholders in a nature that's bigger than them, larger than them, and that they need to understand and they need to integrate into their daily lives more than it does today. And therefore, this is a way of reaching families and a way of having people see a different future, because then they accept the transformation because they can see the the added value that this change will bring to them. And I think that's very interesting, because going on to this question of political courage, and I think it's so important in the ability to convince people around you, and the machine of the administration. I worked for 35 years as a civil servant in the city of Montreal, and to have an elected official to have the courage to defend our positions and knowing that they're going to get heat for it. But this motivates us to support them and work harder for them as well. And when we were talking last night about these questions with Jeanjean, with Mr. Jeanjean, we were talking about the alignment that's necessary between the political vision and the capacity, the administrative capacity to deliver those. And when they're aligned, you can do pretty much anything. You can achieve miracles. And I do think this is extremely important. Do you have anything to say, Mr. Jeanjean, on that point? Yes, absolutely. In terms of political courage, and I'm not going to talk about the different departments and the civil servants, but thanks for raising this question, Baptiste, because I think it does bring two things. It provides a vision, a clear vision, and for the services that work behind us and with us, because Pierre Hermic wanted to have a delegation that deals with public spaces. And what this means to say is the vision I have on the public spaces is not limited only to mobility or to renovation of roadways or nature, which is often in parks and not the other side in the street. What the mayor wanted was to have a delegation, a holistic view, shall we say, of all of these aspects of public spaces, and therefore there's a very clear vision, and then the services can work together on a very simple objective. And political courage takes another form as well, and that's when we go beyond these consultations. And this is part of the DNA of our vision of urban politics, but a policy. But it's not just some gravel in your shoe that's going to make us back down, shall we say. And I think that it's appreciated that we respect their work, their engagement is respected. It's not their time, they're not wasting their time with us. And I think that is something important. And at the end, it's also a question for the inhabitants, because when people want this and we've developed this desire, they also see that some people say, oh, well, we've got to go through that. We have to do it. So it's inevitable. So it's not necessarily because of passion, but they are resigned to it. They've convinced it. And I think political courage can lead to this, and the consequence of that is action. And there's been 4 years, and we've been in power now, and talk about these guides. The Bassin, our flow quarter, 2011, 30,000 square meters, 2024, 60,000 square meters of parks. Just looking at you to get that, my numbers are approximate, but it's roughly that. But having this ability to move fast and judge us on our actions, judge us on the facts. We're not just it's not a concept, it's not theoretical, it's not just words, it's a concrete policy that's translated into action. And not dogmatic, and above all, not dogmatic. Well, thank you very much. And Laure, do we have time for some questions from the room, from the floor? from the floor. Are there anybody who would like to add any comments or? In the meantime, in the room and the floor, if people, please do feel free to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to share the detail of projects with you because there were questions around the specific project and the digs as well. It's not about cutting down trees. I fight tooth and nail to save trees on Sundays with people in their homes. So it's a question of making the banks more natural and having the biosphere here that's natural. And this is important. Will require removing some trees, but nothing simple in life. So if you have questions, do feel free. I'm just inviting people to talk. So, Madam Papin, did you have a word to say? And just an element as well regarding administrative culture as well and political courage. The support of the administrative teams, and just put my international cap on, how incredibly important these international networks are and these collaborative networks are, including on a technical level. And there's something in my delegation, I think, on international action, I think is extremely important in involving agents and getting them involved in these networks, because for them, it's a source of intellectual nourishment for them, but also valorizing the expertise that we're lucky enough to benefit from in Tiny. And I think it's very important indeed for them. And I think they do appreciate that they get involved in these networks and have their expertise valorized. And okay, so I'll just walk over here. Just a couple of questions to go a bit further in the debate. The first question is the levers we've discussed, and one of the subjects that is important to me is preserving nature that we already have. And we're at 30 years, 50 years for a tree to really develop. Have you planned and going further in terms of planning, in terms of preserving existing trees? Because it seems to me that's an extremely important aspect, that should be engraved in stone. And the second question regarding the next steps, we continue planting. And this is for teams and the elected officials, but so management. So in terms of we need people to accompany this, to manage this, to maintain this. It's very important in the first 3 years, but it's also long-term important. So just to give you an example, in Lyon, there are 3 more times as many gardeners in Lyon as there are in Bordeaux. Have you planned on employing real gardeners to maintain all of these plants? This is a universal question. It's the same for Montreal as well. So the first question, what was the first question? Okay, for planning. So protecting existing plants and trees in our planning, I could have gone into a great deal more detail on this. We did talk about how the importance of the memory of a tree, and we haven't spoken about well-being, but I'll keep it short. But of course, one of the first objectives is preservation. When we get to Jalal Park, 45 hectares. There was a real estate development project that had been designed. We stopped this project, and this is owned by the metropolitan area. We didn't need to buy it, but we did need to stop this project. And apart from the landscaper, so with us is all this that would have been as costs for the community. Another example on the right bank, you've been there, I think. A whistleblower said that a 2-hectare wood that is being purchased for building, and the designs have been done, the drawings have been done. It's very complicated indeed to buy this land because it provides nothing, but we'll get there. We talk about political courage. We need political courage to do this, and a lot of money to be able to buy this land as well. And the only consequence, numerical, is that it will cost a lot of money. But we do it. We get there. And thanks, Pierre Leomic, for supporting us in doing this. So it's preservation. Now, in terms of town planning, we're told you have 6 months to make your changes. 6 months. We did it. 2020, we arrived. We put a participative budget in place. We managed to classify 180 trees in the private sector on private land. And this means we need to have a website. This means we need to have a team that does this and gets all the requests. We need experts to look at each tree, go to their homes, go to their properties, look at these. Then we need a commission that analyzes all of the technical documents that have been done by the different services. Then we decide yes or no. We got to 180 trees. Before then, there were 40 trees. We had 40 protected trees. In 6 months, we got up to 180. So in our town planning documents, they've become more complex. But in the first 6 months, we needed a lot more time to do a lot more. But it's a very, very good question. You're absolutely right. And this needs to be done. So I think about this every day, and the question of water as well. Even if yesterday morning we had probably some ideas regarding this, but the question of water as well. And this is a revolution in terms of town planning and building, and in terms of management as well, because all of these squares, all of these areas that we're re-greening, we're planting. Yesterday there was a machine that would drive through. I don't know too much about this, going 5 kilometers a day. And now you've got a gardener who's going and doing it an hour on that site. And where it would take, for example, once or twice a week, he needs to go through almost every day, bearing in mind the maintenance that this requires. So each step we make, each evolution involves a quota, of time, of maintenance, of upkeep. And when we get to a certain quota, this means we do need to hire people.
And that will be the key challenge for the city of the future. Renaturing means managing water and managing the different sites. And we need to move forward on that. We need to think about it, but we need to get on with it too. I won't go into more detail. We have time for one more person to speak. Just if I could say this, we need to rethink the management of the city and its commons. Today, in front of your home, you have the refuse people who come to pick up your waste. You have the electricity and you have the local departments which come because there are difficulties between neighbours. We need to change the method of all the different people, the waste collection, the local support services, the gardening. Everything needs to be rethought to make it more local. I have 5 streets under my responsibility. We have one person doing everything there who can answer all the requests and can bring in different specialists. It's not one person who does, so we have to really rethink the whole method for managing our public spaces. And also use the private sector. And I think really that's very interesting to have this sort of local person who's responsible for management of the place. I have a question about greening. We've talked a lot about us, but there are going to be future generations too. I wanted to know if you have a program for greening schools. Schools are perhaps places where children can learn about these things, understand and make themselves understood. And Baptiste can perhaps talk about education, but there's also work being done on the schoolyards. I was talking about reorganizing public space, but also reorganizing our work to be more horizontal or transversal, working with the parks and gardens, with the different departments, working with the children's affairs, with culture, with transport, and all these different departments are taking account of the issue of renaturing. So for schools, there has been a program passed with a defined budget. We're getting away from the idea of parents who might organize things locally and do something in their schoolyard. Now it is institutionalized. There is a program which has been passed, and we're going to re-nature green 100% of our schoolyards with a threefold objective: to bring nature back and manage water, not necessarily plant trees, although there are already some, but bringing back nature, reorganization of the schoolyard to allow sports activities, perhaps calmer moments, and then also inclusion. Those are the three objectives, and also then pedagogy as a fourth one. So when we're redeveloping the schoolyards, we're creating small areas for sports. We're putting in plants which can be used for cooking, and the leaves from the trees can be used for crafts activities, for composition. So that's something which is already in place and which will be of benefit to all our pupils. And for this notion of transversality, we're working in schools and also the streets around schools. We can't do 100% here, but some schools are on busy roads where we can't do things, but 80% of our schools will have pedestrian streets in front of them. That's the first step. And the second will be these pedestrian streets. You can go and see Rue Case Major in Bordeaux if you want. And the streets will be greened. We'll take out the cars, reorganize the space, and then bring nature back. So Rue Case Major will no longer be a straight street. There'll be plants, trees planted in the earth, playground, play areas in the street, so that the population can take back ownership of the street. And if you see the photograph in 2020 and in 2024 of that street before and after, everybody's going to accept that. And how can we measure that? Is that today the schools are asking us, when are you going to include our schoolyard in your program or our street? So the demand is there. We're getting too much in the way of demand, if anything. And the accessible schoolyards outside school times, I wanted to keep it short, but part of the model in time is that the schoolyards may be used in the evening or at weekends or in summer for other uses than that of the school. And in the new schools being designed, this will be the case. In older schools, it's more complicated because we have to change the whole access system, security system. But renaturing, we're making progress, quick progress. And on opening the schools outside school times, that's a bit more complicated, but we will do it on some sites before the end of 2026. Because it's a change in our whole model of society. It's the whole model we're changing. Reorganizing the use of public space, the design of public space, our local districts, business. So it's not just renaturing, it really is implying a new society, a new model for our life together. I just wanted to mention this question of culture. I was lucky enough to live in a Nordic country, in Finland, and this question of the relationship between public and private space is very, very different. And we see that this is a cultural obstacle. We do perhaps have today this notion of opening up this space locally, but it's not a issue in other countries, but we are making progress. And I'd like to echo your conclusions of workshop 2 on cultural value. And in addition to what Céline just said, we have prepared a projection of cultural and artistic activity that should change the relationship between the cultural stakeholder and the child. It shouldn't be occasional contact, but try to generate a closer contact in this system. Currently, we have 50% of the pupils in the schools we manage, the public schools of the city of Bordeaux, which are part of a patronage system. Working with the Botanical Garden, the Natural History Museum, which accompany certain schools throughout the school year for 2 years. And the idea is not that they should be organizing all the cultural activities of the school. The idea is that how they can accompany a pedagogical project and contribute to it as cultural stakeholders, scientific culture in this case, and ecological and environmental culture. How can they pass on things, accompany the teaching project of the school, and help the children to understand ecological concerns while also asking other cultural stakeholders to sign a charter and to prepare for this change of model and to take ownership of it in their practices. And this can feed all these projects, but we're going a bit further. We're one of the few large cities in France which is capable of offering classes, field trips in green, totally green environments, where we can take the school children to a totally natural area just outside the city centre, where they can really appreciate the relationship with plants and with nature, and they bring back home or to their school a sensitive appreciation of life with plants, and this can then have an impact. So when we talk about genuine cultural change, the idea really is to say that the intimate experience of the child that will stay with it throughout their lives, and the experience of the parents when they come to pick up their children and talk about what they've been doing at school that day. And when they come to the school which has been greened, and whether perhaps they can go at weekends as well, these are all the different steps in the project, and when they see the change in the comfort that this represents, bringing their child to school in a green, pedestrian, specially laid out street, these can all become new commons, and that really puts an end to any need for debate and the strength we have. And what we are is that the city of Bordeaux has profoundly changed. But 25% of the population has been replaced. It's a very young population, and that population, as Didier said at the beginning, when we survey people, they're saying themselves that they want this change. And so we have proposed this avant-garde project, which wasn't at all the philosophy of the city before. This corresponds to what this young population wants, and they're contributing to this change and also accept much more rapid change than what was possible beforehand with state-driven urbanism. And so there's more debate and more of a search to take ownership of the change, and this allows us to move forward. And also this change of population and this change of culture means that little by little certain obstacles will be reduced or disappear. Yes, and I would even like to say at times that there aren't really any obstacles. We talked about the political obstacles, but today we're so far behind. The whole playing field is so large. There are so many sites we can work on that when we do say that, okay, here, because of the networks, we can't do this, or because of the fire brigade, we can't work on this square, that will be in 10 years' time. But through until then, we'll have done so much that there'll only be problems in a few streets. The whole scope of action is such that we have an enormous amount of things to do. I don't know if this is the best conclusion, but what I would like to say is that it is possible, and what drives all three of us and the whole of the team is to explain that it is possible, and that all these obstacles can be not overcome, but negotiated with the fire brigades, with the architects, with the local people. We've explained how. And personally, I believe in the possibility of a happier future, and little by little we are moving towards that, because the long term, it takes a long time for the tree to grow and to become a big tree. But by creating the spaces where we can begin to create the young saplings, things can go quickly. And that's what I would like to get across. You also said at the beginning, the technicians know what to do. We have the methods, we have the ideas. So it is possible, and that's what we're trying to demonstrate. I think that's the best conclusion possible. After these 2 days, I'll just add, so let's get on with it. Thank you very much to all three of you. In that case, I'll just thank the technical team, the team of Arc en Rêve for welcoming us here, the interpreters, and we are going to start working to put all of these ideas into shape, and we're counting on you to continue working with us and to inform people around you of all the interest of this collaborative networking. Thank you very much.